I told you not to move him.
Take your hand off me, officer. You are now physically interfering with patient care.
That's it! You're obstructing! You're under arrest! No! Wait!
The Florida sun was relentless, beating down on the manicured lawns of the Avalon Park neighborhood in Orlando. It was the kind of Tuesday morning that belonged on a postcard, quiet and deceptively peaceful. But inside the open doors of a modest beige house, peace was in short supply. Maya Jordan, her face a mask of intense focus, knelt beside a man whose life was slipping away on his own living room floor. At 42, Maya had been a paramedic for nearly 2 decades, her movements economical and precise, honed by thousands of calls just like this one. Her hands, steady and sure, worked on the chest of Arthur Henderson, a 68-year-old retired schoolteacher whose heart had decided, without warning, to betray him. "Stay with me, Arthur. Stay with me," she murmured, her voice a low, calming undercurrent in the room's rising panic. Arthur's wife, Carol, stood by the doorway, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Maya's partner, Liam, a younger but competent EMT, was preparing an IV line, his brow furrowed in concentration. The air was thick with the sterile scent of alcohol swabs and the metallic tang of fear. "Pulse is thready and erratic, Liam," Maya said, never taking her eyes off her patient. "His skin is cool and clammy, classic signs of a major cardiac event. Let's get the defibrillator pads on him now." Liam moved quickly, tearing open the packaging. They worked in a seamless, practiced rhythm, a dance of life-saving they had performed countless times. Maya had started her career in the chaos of Miami before moving to Orlando for a quieter pace. But she'd learned long ago that a medical emergency didn't care about the zip code. Trouble could find you just as easily on a sleepy suburban street as it could on a downtown thoroughfare. She had seen it all: horrific car accidents, tragic overdoses, the silent, lonely passings of the elderly. She delivered babies in the back of the ambulance and held the hands of soldiers bleeding out in foreign lands during her years as a combat medic in the Army Reserve. That experience had forged an unbreakable calm in her, an ability to shut out the noise and focus on the one thing that mattered: the patient. And right now, Arthur Henderson was all that mattered. His face was a ghastly shade of gray, his breathing shallow and ragged. "Charging to 200, Liam announced, his voice tight. "Clear," Maya commanded, pulling her hands back from Arthur's chest. The defibrillator whined as it charged. Carol Henderson let out a small, choked sob. "I'm clear. You're clear. Everybody's clear." The machine delivered its jolt, and Arthur's body arched violently off the floor before slumping back down. Maya's fingers were immediately back on his neck, searching for a pulse. For a heart-stopping second, there was nothing. Then, a faint, fluttery beat. "We've got a rhythm," she breathed, a small measure of relief cutting through the tension. "It's weak, but it's there. Let's get him on oxygen and push one of the epi." They were in the critical window, the handful of minutes that would decide whether Arthur Henderson would live to see another sunset. They needed to stabilize him for transport, to get him to the cardiac unit at the hospital where surgeons could do what she couldn't. Every action was deliberate, every decision weighed in fractions of a second. She was just about to administer the epinephrine when she heard the crunch of heavy boots on the driveway outside. She didn't look up. In her world, the only uniform that mattered in this moment was her own. Police often responded to medical calls to secure the scene, but they were usually a background presence, handling traffic or calming family members. They knew the paramedics were in charge of the patient. But the presence that filled the doorway was different. It wasn't the quiet, professional backup she was used to. It was a solid wall of blue, radiating an aura of impatience and authority that was immediately out of place. A shadow fell across her and her patient, a sudden, unwelcome chill in the sun-drenched room. "What's the situation here?" a voice demanded, sharp and laced with an aggressive edge that made the hairs on Maya's arms stand on end. She still didn't look up, her focus locked on drawing the correct dosage into the syringe. Her patient's life depended on her not being distracted. Every second counted. "Ma'am, I asked you a question," the voice insisted, closer now. "I'm Officer Thorne, Orlando PD. I need you to tell me what's going on." Maya finally glanced up, her eyes meeting those of a young, white police officer. He couldn't have been more than 30, with a fresh-faced, almost boyish look that was contradicted by the hard set of his jaw and the proprietary way he surveyed the scene. His hand was resting on his holstered firearm, a posture meant to convey unquestionable control. His name tag read, M. Thorne. He wasn't looking at the dying man on the floor. He was looking at her, his gaze evaluative and dismissive. "I'm paramedic Maya Jordan," she said, her voice even and professional, betraying none of her irritation. "I'm with Orange County EMS. We have a 68-year-old male in cardiac arrest. We are stabilizing him for immediate transport." She turned her attention back to Arthur, inserting the needle into the IV port and slowly depressing the plunger. The epinephrine, a drug to restart the heart, flowed into his veins. "I need you to step outside with me so I can get a statement," Officer Thorne commanded. It wasn't a request. Maya paused, syringe still in hand, unable to believe what she was hearing. Liam looked up from monitoring the vitals, his expression a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Officer, this man's heart is failing," Maya stated, spelling it out as if to a child. "He is my only priority right now. We can talk after he is safely in the ambulance and on his way to the hospital." Thorne took another step into the room, his boots scuffing on the hardwood floor. "The scene needs to be secured before anyone is transported," he said, his voice rising slightly. "That's my priority. I need to know if there was any foul play. I need to identify everyone present. I need you to step away from him and let me do my job." Maya felt a surge of disbelief, followed by a cold wave of anger. She had worked alongside hundreds of police officers in her career. She had coordinated with them on chaotic accident scenes and tense domestic disputes. They had a job to do, and she had hers. There was a mutual respect, an understanding that when a life was on the line, the medics took the lead. This officer, however, seemed to operate under a different set of rules. His ego had entered the room before he had. "With all due respect, officer," she said, her tone hardening just enough to convey her seriousness, "my job, my legal and moral duty, is to this patient. There is no evidence of foul play here. His wife called 911 because he collapsed. He is having a heart attack. You are welcome to speak with her." She gestured with her head toward the terrified Carol, "or my partner, but I am not leaving my patient's side." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "Are you refusing to cooperate with a police officer?" "I am refusing to abandon a man who is dying," Maya countered, her gaze unwavering. "There's a difference. Liam, let's get the gurney. We need to move. Now." Liam, looking nervously between the paramedic and the police officer, hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding and heading for the ambulance. Thorne watched him go, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He then turned his full attention back to Maya, who was now checking Arthur's pulse again. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. It was no longer just a medical crisis. It had become a standoff. The quiet, sunlit living room had transformed into a battleground, not for Arthur Henderson's life, but for authority. And Officer Thorne had clearly decided he was going to be the one to win it. He seemed to view her not as a fellow first responder, but as an obstacle, a challenge to his absolute control. And it was a challenge he was not prepared to let go. "Let's try this again," Officer Thorne said, his voice dangerously low. "I am conducting an investigation. You are interfering. I need your identification, and I need you to step away from that man." Maya didn't even look at him this time. "My identification is in the ambulance. You can get it after I finish saving this man's life," she replied, her focus on the portable heart monitor. The weak, erratic line was still far from stable. "His blood pressure is dangerously low." "I'm not going to ask you a third time, ma'am." The use of ma'am was a thinly veiled insult, a dismissal of her professional title. "And I'm not going to let this man die while you're on a power trip. Maya shot back, her patience finally snapping. She instantly regretted the unprofessional tone, but the officer's reckless disregard for the emergency was infuriating. She took a breath, forcing herself back into the calm, controlled professional she was trained to be. "Officer Thorne," she began again, her voice measured. "Under Florida statute, as the highest trained medical professional on scene, I have authority over patient care. Interfering with a paramedic performing their duties is against the law. I am respectfully asking you to step back and allow me to do my job." This recitation of the law seemed to enrage him further. It was as if she had challenged his very existence. "You think you can quote the law to me?" he sneered. "I am the law here." Liam returned with the gurney, maneuvering it into the living room. The clatter of the metal frame seemed to echo in the tense silence. "Let's get him loaded," Maya instructed, ignoring Thorne. "On my count. 1, 2, 3. She and Liam positioned their hands to lift Arthur onto the gurney. As they began to move him, Thorne stepped forward and placed a heavy hand on Maya's shoulder. "I told you not to move him." Maya froze. The touch was not just a steadying hand, it was a physical assertion of dominance. She could feel the pressure of his fingers digging into her shoulder muscle. She looked from his hand to his face. His eyes were blazing with a furious certainty. He genuinely believed he was in the right. "Take your hand off me, officer," she said, her voice dropping to an icy calm. "You are now physically interfering with patient care. You are causing a delay that could kill him. If he dies, it will be on you." "That's it. You're obstructing my investigation," Thorne declared, his voice ringing with a sort of righteous triumph. "You're under arrest." The words hung in the air, so absurd they barely registered. Under arrest? For what? For doing her job. Carol Henderson gasped from the doorway. Liam stared, his mouth agape, utterly paralyzed by the scene unfolding. A neighbor, drawn by the commotion, was now standing on the front lawn, his cell phone held up and recording. "You can't be serious," Maya said, shaking her head in disbelief. "Arrest me for saving a life. Is that what your badge means to you?" "It means you do what I say when I say it," Thorne growled, his grip on her shoulder tightening. "Now stand up and put your hands behind your back." Maya made a split-second decision. Her entire being, every fiber of her training and her conscience, screamed at her to stay with her patient. She could not, would not, abandon Arthur Henderson. She looked down at the man on the floor, his life hanging by a thread, and then back at the officer whose pride was apparently more important. "No," she said, the word clear and unwavering. "My duty is to him. I will not leave him." She tried to turn back to Arthur to continue her work, but Thorne was faster. With a sudden, violent motion, he yanked her arm behind her back, twisting her away from her patient. Maya cried out, more from shock than pain. The world tilted as she was spun around, her face now just inches from Thorne's. The smell of his sweat and the fury in his eyes filled her senses. She saw the glint of metal as he pulled out his handcuffs. In the background, she could hear Carol Henderson screaming. She could see more neighbors gathering outside, their phones all pointed in her direction, silent witnesses to this madness. The cold, unforgiving steel of the handcuffs bit into Maya's wrists. The sharp metallic click as they locked into place was a sound of finality, a sound that severed her from her patient and her duty. Officer Thorne had done the unthinkable. He had arrested a paramedic in the middle of a life-saving procedure. The scene devolved into chaos. Carol Henderson was now sobbing uncontrollably, her cries mixing with the shouts of disbelief from the neighbors who had gathered on the lawn. "What are you doing? She's trying to help him!" one man yelled from his porch, his phone camera steady. "You can't do that! He's dying!" a woman screamed, rushing toward the house before stopping short at the sight of Thorne's glare. Thorne seemed oblivious to the growing crowd and the chorus of condemnation. His focus was entirely on subduing Maya, as if she were a dangerous criminal instead of a medical professional. He pulled her roughly toward the front door, away from the man she had sworn to protect. "My patient," Maya pleaded, her voice cracking as she twisted her head to look back. "Liam, don't let him die! Don't let him die!" Liam, who had been frozen in shock, was jolted back into action by her words. He dropped to his knees beside Arthur, his hands, though shaking, immediately resuming chest compressions. He was a good EMT, but he was alone now, stripped of his lead paramedic, forced to manage a critical cardiac arrest on his own. The odds for Arthur Henderson had just gotten catastrophically worse. Thorne marched Maya out of the house and across the pristine lawn, a spectacle for the entire neighborhood. The bright sunlight felt like a spotlight, illuminating her humiliation. She was acutely aware of the cameras, of the multiple angles capturing her in her blue uniform, hands cuffed behind her back, being forced into a police car like a common felon. She had worn this uniform with pride for 20 years. It was a symbol of help, of compassion, of competence. Now it felt like a costume in a surreal nightmare. He pushed her into the back of his patrol car, the hot plastic of the seat burning against her skin. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, encasing her in a cage of glass and steel. Through the metal grate, she watched as Thorne stood by his car, speaking into his radio, his posture rigid and defensive. He was crafting his narrative, justifying the unjustifiable. From her vantage point, she had a clear view of the house. She saw Liam, his face pale and strained, continuing to work on Arthur in the living room. She saw Carol Henderson collapse onto her front steps, overwhelmed by grief and fear. And she saw the phones, at least a dozen of them now, all recording. They were her only hope. Those phones were capturing a truth that no police report could erase. They were documenting the professional calmness of a paramedic under unimaginable pressure and the volatile, ego-driven aggression of a police officer who had lost control. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Each second that ticked by was a second Arthur wasn't being transported, a second his heart was being starved of oxygen. The wail of another siren grew louder, and a second ambulance, a backup unit, screamed to a halt in front of the Hendersons' house. Two more paramedics rushed inside, their faces grim as they took in the scene. They were an ALS, Advanced Life Support Unit, the kind Maya herself commanded. They would be able to take over, but precious time had been squandered, time that Arthur Henderson did not have. Thorne's decision to arrest her had created a critical, unforgivable delay, a delay measured not in minutes, but in heartbeats. Trapped in the back of the patrol car, Maya watched the scene unfold with a sense of horrifying detachment. The heat inside the vehicle was oppressive, sticking her uniform to her skin, but she barely noticed. All she could focus on was the frantic activity at the Henderson house. The new paramedic team, led by a veteran she recognized named David Chen, worked with desperate urgency. They swarmed around Arthur, their movements a blur of controlled energy. Maya could mentally tick off the procedures they were performing, the drugs they were administering. She saw them finally load Arthur onto the gurney, his body still and pale. David glanced toward the patrol car, his eyes finding Maya's. His expression was one of pure, unadulterated shock. He knew her. They had worked dozens of scenes together over the years. Seeing her in handcuffs, sitting in the back of a police car while a patient coded, was something so far outside the realm of possibility that it simply didn't compute. He gave a slight, bewildered shake of his head before turning his attention back to his patient. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and with a final piercing wail of its siren, it sped away, carrying Arthur Henderson and whatever was left of his chances. Maya leaned her head back against the window, a profound sense of failure washing over her. It wasn't her failure, she knew that logically, but the feeling was there all the same. A patient she was responsible for had been torn from her care. She had been unable to protect him, not from his failing heart, but from the man now climbing into the driver's seat in front of her. Officer Thorne started the engine, the air conditioning blasting on, a cold comfort that did nothing to quell the fire in her stomach. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak. He just put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the chaotic scene, the distraught wife, the stunned neighbors, her abandoned partner, behind. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the police radio. Maya decided to break it. "You have any idea what you just did?" she asked, her voice devoid of the anger she felt, replaced by a chillingly calm tone. Thorne glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes cold and empty. "I did my job. You obstructed it. End of story." "That man is likely to have severe, irreversible brain or heart damage because of the delay you caused," Maya stated, each word a carefully placed stone. "You delayed defibrillation. You delayed advanced cardiac medications. You delayed transport to a cardiac catheterization lab. You traded a man's life for your ego. I hope you're proud of yourself." His jaw tightened. "You should have followed my orders. None of this would have happened if you had just shown me some respect." "Respect?" Maya let out a short, bitter laugh. "Respect is earned, officer. It isn't demanded at the expense of a human life. I respected my patient. I respected my oath. I respected the law that gives me the authority to provide care. You respected nothing but the badge you hide behind." Thorne fell silent again, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He knew she was right. He had to know. But men like him never admitted it. They doubled down, built walls of justification around their bad decisions, and blamed everyone but themselves. She could see the storm brewing behind his eyes, not of guilt, but of fury. He was angry that she had challenged him, that she had exposed him, that she was sitting in his back seat, cuffed and detained, yet still somehow in control of the situation. He had arrested her body, but he hadn't broken her spirit, and he hated her for it. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was far from over. He had started a war, and he had no idea of the forces he had just unleashed. The videos were already being uploaded. The calls were already being made. The story of what happened on that quiet, sun-drenched street was already spreading. The drive to the Orlando Police Department's downtown precinct was short, but it gave Maya time to center herself. The initial shock and adrenaline were fading, replaced by a cold, methodical resolve. She had been in crisis situations her entire adult life. This was just a different kind of battlefield. The objective remained the same: assess, adapt, and overcome. When Thorne pulled her from the car at the Sally Port, she walked with her head held high, her cuffed hands a symbol not of guilt, but of the injustice that had occurred. Inside, the station buzzed with the typical afternoon activity. Officers typed at their desks, the smell of burnt coffee hung in the air, and the murmur of conversations filled the space. As Thorne led her toward the booking desk, several heads turned. A few officers did a double-take, recognizing her uniform, then her face. Paramedics were a familiar sight in police stations, but they were usually accompanying a patient or filing a report, not wearing handcuffs. A stocky, graying sergeant with a name tag that read Miller looked up from his paperwork, his bushy eyebrows knitting together in a deep frown. "Thorne, what the hell is this?" he asked, his voice a low rumble of authority that Thorne's lacked. "Sarge, this is Maya Jordan, arreter for obstruction of justice and resisting without violence," Thorne announced, a note of pride in his voice as he recited the charges. Sergeant Miller stood up, his gaze shifting from Thorne to Maya, taking in her uniform and the calm, steady look in her eyes. He was a veteran of the force, a man who had seen everything, and his internal lie detector was screaming. "She's an Orange County paramedic," he stated, not as a question but as a fact. "On a call?" "Yes, Sarge. A cardiac arrest. She was interfering with my scene," Thorne said, his confidence beginning to waver slightly under Miller's scrutinizing gaze. "Interfering how?" Miller pressed, walking around his desk to get a closer look. "By saving the guy's life?" The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. "She refused to identify herself, refused to follow my lawful orders to step away from the subject," Thorne recited, sounding like he was reading from a script. Miller looked at Maya. "Is that right, ma'am?" "I told the officer I would provide anything he needed after my patient was stabilized," Maya said, her voice clear and even. "I was in the middle of administering life-saving medication. My patient's heart had stopped. There was no time. I told him he was delaying critical care." Miller's eyes narrowed on Thorne. "So you pulled her off the patient?" "I had to secure the scene, Sarge." "You secured the scene by arresting the one person who could keep the guy from dying?" Miller shook his head in disgust. Get her processed. Then you and I are going to have a long talk in my office. A very long talk. He turned and walked away, leaving Thorne looking flustered and angry. The booking process was a humiliating ordeal made bearable only by Maya's unshakable composure. She was fingerprinted. Her mugshot was taken. Her personal effects were inventoried by a young, nervous-looking officer who seemed deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation. He laid out the contents of her pockets, her wallet, her keys, her phone. And then he pulled out her paramedic credentials. He stared at the plastic card, at her photo next to the list of her qualifications. Paramedic, State of Florida, Advanced Cardiac Life Support, Pediatric Advanced Life Support, Pre-Hospital Trauma Life Support, 20 years of service, an exemplary record. He looked from the card to Maya, then over at Thorne, who was leaning against a wall trying to look nonchalant. The young officer swallowed hard and continued his work in silence. The irony was staggering. The very identification Thorne had demanded, the proof of her authority to be there, was now being logged as evidence in her arrest for being there. He could have verified her identity in seconds by running her name. He could have asked her partner. He could have simply waited 90 seconds for her to finish treating her patient. But it was never about her identification. It was about her defiance. It was about a black woman who did not immediately submit to his authority. And for that, in his mind, she had to be punished. As they led her to a holding cell, the steel door slamming shut behind her, she knew one thing for sure. Thorne thought he had won. He thought this was the end. He had no idea it was just the beginning. The holding cell was cold and sterile, a small concrete box with a metal bench. The air tasted stale, and the distant sounds of the police station felt a world away. Maya sat on the bench, not in defeat, but in a state of focused contemplation. She replayed the entire incident in her mind, every word, every action. She had followed her training. She had followed the law. She had prioritized her patient. She had done everything right. The system, in the form of Officer Thorne, had done everything wrong. The question now was whether the rest of the system would correct his error. She had been in the cell for less than an hour when she saw a figure approaching. It was a woman in a sharply tailored gray suit, carrying a leather briefcase. She moved with an air of purpose and confidence that seemed to part the air in front of her. She stopped outside Maya's cell, her intelligent, discerning eyes meeting Maya's. "Maya Jordan?" the woman asked. Her voice was calm and commanding. "Yes," Maya said, standing up and walking to the bars. "My name is Evelyn Reed," the woman said, extending a business card through the bars. "I'm an attorney. Your union president, Frank, called me as soon as he heard what happened. He sends his full support. I'm here to get you out of this ridiculous situation." A wave of relief washed over Maya. She wasn't alone. The union was already moving. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "It's what I do," Evelyn said, pulling a notepad and a pen from her briefcase. "I specialize in civil rights cases, particularly those involving misconduct by law enforcement. Unfortunately, it's a busy field." She clicked her pen. "Now, I need you to tell me everything. Start from the moment the call came in. Don't leave out a single detail, no matter how small it seems." For the next 30 minutes, Maya recounted the morning's events with the same precision she would use to detail a patient's medical chart. She described Arthur Henderson's condition, the treatment she was providing, Officer Thorne's arrival, his aggressive demeanor, his escalating demands, her repeated attempts to explain the medical necessity of her actions, the physical assault, the arrest, and the conversations in the car. Evelyn listened intently, her pen flying across the page, occasionally interjecting with a sharp, clarifying question. "Did he ever tell you what crime he was investigating?" "No. He just kept saying he needed to secure the scene," Maya replied. "A scene with a 68-year-old man, his wife, and 2 paramedics? Secure it from what?" Evelyn mused aloud, a wry smile touching her lips. "Did he read you your Miranda rights?" "No." "Did you ever physically resist him?" "Absolutely not. I verbally refused to leave my patient. When he grabbed me, I pulled back instinctively, but I never fought him. I was trying to treat a man." Evelyn clicked her pen shut and slid the notepad back into her briefcase. This is not just a wrongful arrest, Maya. This is a textbook case of multiple civil rights violations. Violation of your Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable seizure, First Amendment retaliation for questioning his authority, and most significantly, a clear violation of state and federal laws regarding interference with emergency medical services. She looked Maya directly in the eye. What he did was not just wrong, it was illegal on multiple levels. Our first step is to get you released. That should be simple. The charges are baseless and won't stand up to even the slightest scrutiny. But that's not the end of it. Not by a long shot. Evelyn's expression hardened. This officer, this department, needs to be held accountable. What happened to you today cannot be allowed to happen to any other first responder. We are going to make sure of that. In that moment, Maya saw more than just a lawyer. She saw a warrior, an advocate who was ready to go to battle for her. For the first time since the cold steel of the handcuffs had closed around her wrists, Maya felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just her fight anymore. True to her word, Evelyn Reed moved with formidable speed. Within an hour, she had spoken with Sergeant Miller, the on-duty lieutenant, and had a very pointed phone call with someone in the city attorney's office. The wheels of bureaucracy, which usually ground so slowly, began to turn with surprising quickness. It was clear the department was already realizing what a catastrophic liability Officer Thorne had created. The door to Maya's cell swung open. Sergeant Miller stood there, his expression grim. "You're being released on your own recognizance, Ms. Jordan," he said, his tone respectful. "The charges are being reviewed, but I don't expect them to go anywhere. You can pick up your belongings at the front desk. My apologies for the actions of my officer." Maya simply nodded, her face unreadable. Apologies wouldn't undo the damage. She walked out of the cell and met Evelyn in the hallway. Her personal effects were returned to her, including her paramedic credentials, which the booking officer handed back with an apologetic look. As she signed the release forms, she could see Officer Thorne through the glass of Sergeant Miller's office, getting the dressing down of his life. It was a small, unsatisfying measure of justice. Stepping out of the air-conditioned precinct into the humid Florida heat felt like surfacing from underwater. Liam was there, waiting by her car, his face etched with worry. He rushed over as soon as he saw her. "Maya, are you okay? I've been calling everyone. Frank at the union, our supervisor." "I'm okay, Liam," she said, managing a weak smile. "Just processed. What about Mr. Henderson? What happened after I was taken?" Liam's face fell, the worry lines deepening. The grim reality of the morning rushed back in, eclipsing her own ordeal. "It wasn't good, Maya," he said, his voice low. "He coded again in the ambulance. David's team had to shock him twice more on the way to the hospital. They got him back, but it took a while." A cold dread spread through Maya's chest. "What's his condition?" "He's in the ICU. He survived the surgery, but the doctors are saying the delay, those minutes we lost, they were critical. The surgeon told David that the prolonged lack of oxygen to the heart muscle caused massive, irreparable damage. He said Mr. Henderson is looking at severe, long-term congestive heart failure. His quality of life, it's never going to be the same." Maya felt the air leave her lungs. It was the worst possible news. They had been so close. She had felt that pulse return, that flicker of life she had fought so hard for. And then it had all been undone. Undone by one man's ego. Arthur Henderson wasn't going to die, but a part of his life had been stolen from him on his living room floor. Not by a heart attack, but by a police officer. Evelyn Reed, who had been standing by, listening quietly, stepped forward. Her professional demeanor was still in place, but there was a new fire in her eyes. "This changes everything," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "This is no longer just a case about a wrongful arrest and a violation of a paramedic's rights. This is now about a catastrophic, life-altering injury to a civilian caused directly by the reckless actions of a police officer. The city isn't just looking at a civil rights violation anymore. They're looking at a multi-million-dollar personal injury lawsuit on top of it, and we are going to make them pay for every single heartbeat Arthur Henderson lost today." Maya looked from her shaken partner to her determined lawyer. The fight was no longer just about her. It was about Arthur. It was about ensuring that no patient ever had to pay the price for a police officer's pride again. The path ahead would be long and arduous, but her resolve had never been stronger. In the days that followed, the story exploded. The cell phone videos shot by Maya's neighbors hit the internet like a firestorm. Local news stations picked it up first, then the national outlets. The footage was stark and undeniable. It showed Maya, calm and professional, kneeling over her patient. It captured Officer Thorne's aggressive entrance, his escalating demands, and the shocking moment he physically pulled her away and cuffed her. The audio was crystal clear, a perfect recording of Maya's desperate pleas to be allowed to treat her patient and Thorne's arrogant dismissal of her duty. Public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. The Orlando Police Department was inundated with furious calls. The mayor's office issued a vague statement about an ongoing internal investigation. Evelyn Reed did not wait for the internal investigation to run its course. She worked with a ferocious efficiency, gathering evidence and preparing a legal assault. She took sworn affidavits from Liam, from the backup paramedic team, and from the neighbors who had filmed the incident. She subpoenaed the 911 call logs, the ambulance dispatch records, and Officer Thorne's body camera footage, which the department was slow to release. Less than 2 weeks after the arrest, Evelyn filed a lawsuit in federal court. It was a legal masterpiece, a comprehensive indictment of the actions of both Officer Thorne and the city of Orlando. The plaintiffs were Maya Jordan and, with their consent, Arthur and Carol Henderson. The complaint listed a litany of charges: false arrest, excessive force, battery, violation of civil rights under the First and Fourth Amendments, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and, crucially, interference with life-saving medical care leading to permanent injury. The lawsuit named Officer Mark Thorne individually and the city of Orlando for its failure to properly train and supervise its officers. The damages sought were $15.2 million. The amount was staggering, designed to send a message. This wasn't a nuisance suit to be settled quietly. This was a declaration of war against a culture of impunity. The city's first move was predictable. Their legal team sent a lowball settlement offer, a sum in the low six figures, contingent on a non-disclosure agreement. It was an attempt to make the problem go away quickly and silently. Evelyn's response was a single blistering page. It rejected the offer outright and stated in no uncertain terms that any future settlement discussions would have to begin with a public apology, the termination of Officer Thorne, a complete overhaul of the department's training protocols for interacting with EMS personnel, and a number that started with 8 figures. This was not just about money for Maya or the Hendersons. It was about systemic change. Maya met with the Hendersons at their home a week after Arthur had been discharged from the hospital. He was a shadow of his former self, tethered to an oxygen tank, his every breath a struggle. The once vibrant retired teacher could now barely walk across the room without becoming exhausted. Carol looked after him with a heartbreaking tenderness, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and a deep, burning anger. "We don't want this to happen to anyone else's family," Arthur said, his voice weak but firm. "That officer, he took my future from me. He took our retirement, our plans to travel." He looked at Maya, his eyes welling with tears. "You were trying to save me, and he stopped you. He has to be held accountable." Maya's resolve, already forged in steel, hardened into diamond. The lawsuit was no longer just a legal strategy. It was a promise she had made to her patient, and a promise she intended to keep. The city had chosen to defend their officers' actions. Now they would face the consequences in a court of law, with the entire nation watching. The discovery phase was about to begin, and Evelyn Reed was ready to uncover every single piece of evidence that would bury Officer Thorne and the department that had allowed him to flourish. The discovery phase of a lawsuit is where battles are won or lost, not in dramatic courtroom speeches, but in the methodical, painstaking work of gathering facts. For Evelyn Reed, it was a hunt, and she was a master predator. She filed a motion to compel the release of Officer Thorne's complete personnel file, and what it revealed was damning. In his 7 years on the force, Thorne had accumulated over 20 citizen complaints, a dozen of them for excessive force and abuse of authority. He had been a defendant in 2 prior lawsuits that the city had quietly settled out of court. Not once had he faced any significant disciplinary action. The file painted a picture of a problem officer, an aggressive patrolman with a clear pattern of escalating conflicts, who had been protected by his department time and time again. Then came the body camera footage. The city had resisted releasing it, claiming it was part of an active investigation, but a federal judge disagreed. When Evelyn and Maya watched it for the first time in a conference room, the air grew still. The footage was even more damning than the cell phone videos. It was shot from Thorne's perspective, capturing his heavy breathing as he exited his car, the aggressive way he strode toward the house, and his immediate confrontational tone. It showed him completely ignoring the critically ill patient on the floor, his vision zeroed in on Maya. Most importantly, it recorded the audio with perfect clarity. Maya's calm, professional explanations about the medical emergency, her citations of state law, her pleas for him to let her do her job, and Thorne's responses, dripping with condescension and rage. The camera captured the moment he laid his hands on her, the lurching view as he spun her around, and the sound of the handcuffs clicking shut. It was a first-person recording of an abuse of power. "He filmed his own crime," Maya whispered, her voice shaking slightly as she watched the screen. "He didn't think it was a crime," Evelyn replied, her expression grim. "He thought it was just another Tuesday. He thought you were just another person who had to do what he said. He never imagined he'd be held accountable." Evelyn's team deposed every person on the scene. Liam's testimony was powerful, a heartbreaking account of watching his partner and mentor be arrested while their patient was dying. The neighbors who filmed the incident provided clear, consistent statements about Thorne's unwarranted aggression. Even the backup paramedic, David Chen, testified that when he arrived, the scene was chaotic not because of a medical issue, but because of the police presence. He stated that in his 25 years as a paramedic, he had never seen an officer arrest a medic during an active patient treatment. But the most powerful evidence would come from the hospital. Evelyn's team gathered all of Arthur Henderson's medical records, a thick file that documented in cold, clinical detail the catastrophic damage to his heart. They charted the timeline, from the 911 call to Maya's arrival, from Thorne's interference to the eventual transport by the second ambulance team. The timeline showed a clear 7-minute gap, a black hole of lost time created solely by Officer Thorne. 7 minutes during which Arthur Henderson's heart muscle was dying. 7 minutes that had changed his life forever. The paper trail of dispatch logs and medical charts was irrefutable. It told the same story as the videos, the same story as the witnesses. It was a story of a hero in a paramedic's uniform and a villain in a cop's. The deposition of Dr. Alistair Finch, the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Orlando Regional Medical Center, took place in a sterile, wood-paneled conference room. Dr. Finch was in his late 50s, a man with a reputation for being as precise with his words as he was with a scalpel. The city's lawyers were present, looking tense and uncomfortable. Officer Thorne was there too, seated next to his union-appointed attorney, his face a mask of defiant indifference. Evelyn Reed began her questioning calmly, establishing Dr. Finch's credentials and his role as the lead surgeon who had operated on Arthur Henderson. Then she walked him through the medical facts of the case, using the thick file of records as her guide. "Dr. Finch, can you describe Mr. Henderson's condition upon his arrival at the emergency room?" Evelyn asked. "He was in cardiogenic shock," Dr. Finch replied, his voice clear and authoritative. "His heart was failing as a pump. We took him directly to the cardiac catheterization lab. We found a 100% blockage of his left anterior descending artery, an injury often called the widowmaker for its high mortality rate. You were able to clear the blockage and place a stent, is that correct?" Yes, we were, but the problem was the amount of time that had passed. In cases like this, we have a saying, time is muscle. Every minute that blood flow is blocked, a portion of the heart muscle dies. It does not regenerate. Evelyn paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. And in Mr. Henderson's case, how significant was the muscle damage? It was catastrophic, Dr. Finch said without a hint of hesitation. He looked directly at the court reporter, ensuring every word was captured. Based on the enzymes in his blood and the subsequent echocardiograms, we determined he lost approximately 40% of his heart's pumping function. This is the direct cause of his current state of severe congestive heart failure. It is a permanent, life-limiting condition. Now came the critical question. Evelyn picked up the timeline, the one meticulously compiled from dispatch logs and witness statements. Doctor, the records show that the first paramedic team was on scene and providing care within 4 minutes of the 911 call. However, the patient did not begin transport to the hospital for another 9 minutes after that. The records indicate a 7-minute delay occurred, during which the lead paramedic was incapacitated. In your expert medical opinion, what was the effect of that 7-minute delay on Mr. Henderson's outcome? The city's attorney started to object, but Evelyn cut him off. It's a direct question about causation, counselor. He is the expert. Dr. Finch adjusted his glasses. He looked at the timeline, then at Arthur Henderson's chart. When he finally spoke, his words were a death blow to the city's case. The effect was devastating, he said. Had Mr. Henderson been transported immediately, within that initial window, the damage would have been significantly less, perhaps 10 to 15% muscle loss. He would have recovered with a near-normal quality of life. That 7-minute delay, at that specific and critical juncture in his heart attack, was the direct and proximate cause of the majority of the heart muscle death. To put it bluntly, those 7 minutes cost Mr. Henderson his health and his future. He went from a patient who should have had a good recovery to one who will be severely disabled for the rest of his life, which has now been statistically shortened. A heavy silence filled the room. Dr. Finch's testimony had built an unbreakable bridge between Officer Thorne's actions and Arthur Henderson's ruined life. It was no longer a matter of opinion or interpretation. It was a medical fact, stated by one of the top cardiac surgeons in the state. Maya, sitting next to Evelyn, felt a profound sadness for Arthur, but also a grim sense of validation. The truth had a voice, and it had just spoken with the unassailable authority of science. She glanced over at Officer Thorne. For the first time, she saw a crack in his armor of arrogance. He was staring at his hands, and he looked for just a moment like a man who was beginning to understand the depth of the hole he had dug for himself. It was 2 weeks later, in the same conference room, that Officer Mark Thorne gave his deposition. He walked in with a practiced swagger, an attempt to project confidence that came across as pure arrogance. He believed the system that had protected him for 7 years would do so again. He was wrong. Evelyn Reed was not a citizen filing a complaint. She was a legal predator, and Thorne was her prey. She spent the first hour lulling him into a false sense of security, asking simple questions about his training, his years on the force, his understanding of police procedure. Thorne answered with smug, clipped responses. Then, she changed tactics. Officer Thorne, let's talk about the morning of the incident. You arrived at the Henderson residence. What was your initial assessment of the scene? It was a chaotic medical situation, Thorne said. My training is to secure the scene and identify all parties. And what threats did you identify that needed securing? Evelyn pressed. Was the 68-year-old man on the floor a threat? Was his terrified wife a threat? Was the paramedic trying to save his life a threat? Everyone is a potential threat until the scene is secure, he recited, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. Evelyn put the enlarged photo of Maya's paramedic credentials on the table in front of him. You demanded identification from paramedic Jordan. Why? It's standard procedure. Is it also standard procedure to demand it from a medical professional while they are in the middle of performing chest compressions and administering life-saving drugs? Is there a box on your form for interrupted a life-saving procedure? Thorne's union attorney objected. Argumentative. I'll rephrase, Evelyn said smoothly. Officer Thorne, were you aware that paramedic Jordan was treating a critical patient? She claimed she was, he sneered. The room went cold. She claimed she was? Evelyn repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. Officer, you saw the man on the floor. You saw the medical equipment. You saw a trained paramedic performing her duties. Do you have any medical training that would lead you to believe she was lying? No, he mumbled. So you, with no medical training, decided to override the judgment of a 20-year veteran paramedic in the middle of a cardiac arrest. I was doing my job, he repeated, his voice rising. Evelyn then played his body camera footage on a large screen, pausing it at key moments. She paused on the image of Maya kneeling over Arthur. What do you see here, officer? I see the paramedic and the subject. You don't see a patient? You see a subject? She played the audio of Maya calmly explaining the situation. Then she played Thorne's angry, demanding responses. The contrast was stark. She told you she had a duty to her patient. She told you that you were interfering. She even cited the law to you. And your response was to arrest her. Why? She was being uncooperative. She was obstructing, Thorne nearly shouted, his composure finally cracking. Obstructing what, officer? What grand investigation were you conducting that was more important than the man's beating heart? Were you investigating the cause of his heart attack? Did you think the cholesterol was a suspect? The union attorney practically leaped from his chair. Objection! Counsel is harassing the witness. But the damage was done. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but her words cutting like a razor. The truth is, Officer Thorne, you didn't care about the patient. You didn't care about procedure. You only cared that a black woman, a professional in her own right, told you no. Your ego couldn't handle it. You couldn't stand that your authority wasn't absolute in that room. So you chose to assert your dominance, and in doing so, you destroyed a man's life and disgraced your badge. Isn't that what really happened? Thorne stared at her, his face flushed with rage, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. For 6 hours, Evelyn had systematically dismantled his justifications, exposed his lies, and laid bare the ugly truth of his character. He wasn't a protector. He was a bully. And for the first time, his bullying was going to have consequences he couldn't escape. The deposition transcript read like a confession. The city's lawyers knew it. Their case had just evaporated. Facing an unwinnable case, the city's attorneys agreed to mediation. It was a last-ditch effort to avoid a public trial and a runaway jury verdict. The mediation was held in a neutral downtown office building, presided over by a retired federal judge named Marcus Cole, a man known for his sharp mind and no-nonsense approach to legal disputes. The city's legal team came in first, armed with risk assessment charts and actuarial tables, trying to reduce the case to a financial calculation. They presented their argument, a weak and watered-down version of Thorne's deposition, claiming he had followed what he believed to be proper procedure in a confusing situation. Then it was Evelyn Reed's turn. She didn't use charts or tables. She started by playing the body camera footage. The 12-minute clip was shown in its entirety on a large screen in the silent room. The retired judge watched, his face impassive, but his eyes missing nothing. The footage ended with the slam of the patrol car door. Next, Evelyn played a short, professionally produced video. It began with photos of Arthur and Carol Henderson before the incident, traveling, gardening, playing with their grandchildren. Healthy, happy, vibrant people. Then, it cut to footage of Arthur as he was now, struggling to breathe, moving slowly with a walker, his face a permanent mask of exhaustion and pain. Finally, she had Dr. Finch's deposition transcript projected onto the screen, highlighting the key passages where he drew a direct, causal line between the 7-minute delay and Arthur's permanent disability. She ended her presentation by introducing Maya, who sat there in her crisp paramedic's uniform, a living embodiment of professionalism and integrity. Evelyn didn't have Maya speak. Her presence was statement enough. Judge Cole called for a recess. When he returned an hour later, he looked not at Evelyn or Maya, but directly at the city's lead attorney. His expression was one of profound disappointment, bordering on contempt. "Counselors," the judge began, his voice leaving no room for argument, "I am going to be very blunt with you. In my 20 years on the federal bench, I have seen many cases of police misconduct. This is one of the most indefensible I have ever encountered." He gestured toward the screen where the video had played. "You are going to take that video into a courtroom in front of a jury of 12 ordinary citizens. They are going to watch one of your officers, who looks like a petulant child throwing a tantrum, pull a paramedic off a dying man because his feelings were hurt. They are going to see a hero trying to save a life get handcuffed for her efforts." He picked up a copy of Dr. Finch's testimony. "Then, they are going to hear from one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in the state, who will tell them in no uncertain terms that the officer's actions directly caused the catastrophic, life-altering injuries to that man. You have no defense, none. Your officer comes across as arrogant and dishonest. Your arguments about procedure are insulting to the intelligence of everyone in this room." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with the city's attorney. "This is not a case you can win. A jury will not just find for the plaintiffs. They will be so outraged by what they see that they will want to punish you. The verdict will be astronomical. It will be a landmark. It will be front-page news for months." He sat back. "My advice to you is to settle this case. Today. For the full amount the plaintiffs are asking for. Because if you don't, I promise you, the number a jury writes on that verdict form will be much, much higher. You are not just facing a legal defeat, you are facing a municipal catastrophe. Do the right thing. End this now." The city's lawyers were pale. The judge had not just analyzed their case, he had eviscerated it. There was no more room for negotiation, no more strategy. There was only surrender. The mediation ended less than an hour later. The city's attorneys, after a frantic series of calls to the mayor's office and the city's risk management department, capitulated completely. They agreed to settle the lawsuit for the full $15.2 million demanded by the plaintiffs. But for Maya and Evelyn, the financial settlement was only part of the victory. The other terms were, in many ways, more important. As part of the settlement agreement, the city of Orlando was legally bound to implement sweeping policy changes within its police department. The agreement, drafted by Evelyn Reed herself, was ironclad. It mandated the creation of a new, standalone training module for all officers, from rookies to veterans, on emergency scene cooperation with EMS personnel. The training, which would be required annually, explicitly stated that in an active medical emergency, the ranking paramedic on scene had command authority over all matters related to patient care. It made clear that any administrative requests by law enforcement, such as securing identification, were secondary to the immediate life-saving needs of the patient. Furthermore, the settlement dictated that any incident involving the detainment or arrest of an on-duty first responder would trigger an automatic and immediate internal affairs investigation to be overseen by an independent civilian review board. It was a mechanism of accountability designed to prevent another officer like Thorne from acting with impunity. And then there was the matter of Officer Mark Thorne himself. 2 weeks after the settlement was finalized and became public record, the Orlando police chief held a press conference. He announced that the internal affairs investigation had concluded and that Officer Thorne had been found to have violated multiple department policies, including abuse of authority, excessive force, and conduct unbecoming of an officer. His employment with the Orlando Police Department was terminated, effective immediately. For Maya, the news of Thorne's firing was not a moment of celebration, but one of somber relief. A dangerous man had been removed from a position of power he was unfit to hold. The system, which had failed so spectacularly on that sunny Tuesday morning, had finally, belatedly, corrected itself. The settlement funds were divided, with the majority going to the Henderson family to cover the immense cost of Arthur's lifelong medical care and to compensate them for his stolen quality of life. The money would ensure he had the best care possible, but it could never give him back his health. Maya used a significant portion of her settlement to do something she felt was a moral necessity. She partnered with her union and Evelyn Reed's law firm to establish a non-profit foundation called the First Responders Shield. Its mission was simple: to provide free legal resources and advocacy for any EMT, paramedic, or firefighter who faced retaliation, discipline, or arrest for prioritizing patient care over improper demands from law enforcement. It was a way to ensure that the next paramedic in her position would not have to fight alone. The victory was complete, but it was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the scars from the battle, both the physical scars on Arthur Henderson's heart and the emotional ones on Maya, would remain forever. The impact of Maya's case rippled far beyond the city limits of Orlando. The videos of her arrest and the subsequent landmark settlement had become a national news story, sparking a much-needed conversation about the often tense interactions between law enforcement and emergency medical services. Paramedic and firefighter unions across the country began re-examining their own local protocols and pushing for clearer, more protective policies. Inspired by the outcome, and with the full backing of her new foundation, Maya became an unlikely but powerful advocate for legislative change. She wasn't a politician or a lobbyist. She was a paramedic. And when she spoke with the unshakable authority of someone who had lived through the worst-case scenario. She and Evelyn Reed worked with a bipartisan group of state legislators in Tallahassee to draft a new bill. They called it the First Response Shield Act. The proposed law was simple but revolutionary. It legally codified the principle that on-duty emergency medical personnel, when providing active patient care, were immune from arrest for minor offenses like obstruction of justice if their actions were taken in the good faith belief that they were necessary for the patient's well-being. It established a clear legal hierarchy at emergency scenes. Medical care for a critical patient took precedence over a non-criminal police investigation. Any officer who violated this would be subject to civil and even criminal penalties. Maya testified before the state legislative committee. She didn't read from a prepared speech. She simply stood before the lawmakers in her uniform and told her story. She described the feeling of Arthur Henderson's fading pulse under her fingertips. She recounted the impossible choice she faced between her patient and an officer's unlawful demand. Every day, thousands of first responders across this state put on a uniform and go to work, ready to run toward the worst moments of people's lives, she said, her voice steady and clear. We do this job because we believe in serving our communities, in saving lives. We cannot do that job effectively if we have to fear being arrested for it. We cannot have paramedics second-guessing their life-saving decisions because they are worried about placating the ego of an officer. When a heart stops, there is no time for a debate over authority. There is only time to act. Her most powerful witness testified right after her. Arthur Henderson, frail and leaning on a cane, slowly made his way to the witness table. He told the lawmakers what it was like to wake up in a hospital, a prisoner in his own body, and learned that his life had been permanently damaged because the paramedic treating him had been handcuffed. She fought for me, he said, his voice raspy. She fought for me when I couldn't. This law, it's not for her. It's for the next person whose heart stops. It's to make sure that the person trying to save them has a shield, not handcuffs. The bill passed both houses of the Florida legislature with overwhelming, near-unanimous support. The governor signed it into law in a public ceremony on the steps of the state capitol. He handed the first pen he used to Arthur Henderson, and the second to Maya Jordan. the media began referring to it as Maya's Law. The new law became a model for the nation. Within 2 years, a dozen other states had passed similar legislation, each one citing the Orlando incident as the catalyst for change. Maya Jordan, the paramedic who just wanted to do her job, had become the architect of a nationwide movement to protect first responders, ensuring that the sanctity of patient care was enshrined not just in protocol, but in law. Years passed. The world moved on. But the events of that day in Avalon Park left an indelible mark. Officer Mark Thorne never worked in law enforcement again. The story of his termination and the $15.2 million settlement followed him, a permanent stain on his reputation that made him unemployable in the field. He became a cautionary tale, a ghost that haunted police academies. The body camera footage of Maya's arrest became a mandatory part of training for both police recruits and paramedic students across the country. For police, it was a brutal lesson in de-escalation, discretion, and the catastrophic consequences of letting ego dictate actions. Instructors would pause the video and ask, "What could Thorne have done differently at this moment?" The answer was always, anything else. For paramedic and EMT students, the footage was a different kind of lesson. It was a masterclass in professionalism under duress. They saw how Maya never raised her voice, how she consistently tried to educate the officer, how her focus remained laser-like on her patient even as the situation spiraled out of control. It taught them not only how to save a life, but how to defend their right to do so. The case, Jordan and Henderson versus City of Orlando, became required reading in law schools for courses on civil rights and municipal liability. Maya Jordan never stopped being a paramedic. She turned down offers to move into administration or to become a full-time instructor. The street, she said, was where she belonged. She continued to work with her partner Liam, riding in the same ambulance, answering the same calls. But something had changed. There was a new level of respect afforded to her and her colleagues by the officers they encountered at scenes. The tragic incident had, in its own painful way, forged a better, clearer understanding between the two branches of emergency services in their city. She still saw Arthur Henderson from time to time. He sent her a card every Christmas with a picture of him and Carol, smiling as best they could. It was a bittersweet reminder of both a life saved and a life irrevocably altered. He was alive because of her. He was disabled because of Thorne. Both truths existed at the same time. Sometimes, during a quiet moment on a long shift, she would think about that day. She would feel the phantom weight of the handcuffs on her wrists and the hot sun on her face. She had won. She had changed laws and policies. She had received justice in a way that few people ever do. But the victory felt less like a triumph and more like a scar that had healed but was still there, a permanent reminder of the day her sacred duty was put to the ultimate test. It was a scar that taught a lesson, not just to her, but to an entire generation of first responders, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to stop helping. The storm had passed, but the air never quite felt the same. For Mark Thorne, the quiet that followed his termination was a deafening roar of failure. His identity, so completely wrapped up in the authority of the badge and the uniform, had been stripped away, leaving behind a hollow man. A psychological post-mortem would suggest his actions stemmed not from malice, but from a profound and fragile insecurity. In his world, control was paramount. He had likely been trained in a system where officer command was absolute, where questioning an order was a sign of dangerous defiance. When Maya Jordan, a black woman in a position of equal, if different, authority, refused to comply, it didn't register as a professional exercising her duty. It registered as a fundamental challenge to his worldview. His aggression was a desperate, panicked attempt to reassert a control he felt slipping away. He wasn't a monster, but something far more common and perhaps more dangerous. A weak man given too much power. For Maya, the quiet moments brought what-ifs, not of regret, but of analysis. What if she had simply complied? The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. Arthur Henderson would have died on his living room floor. Her compliance would have made her complicit in his death. What if she had been more aggressive, had yelled back at Thorne from the start? The outcome could have been tragically worse, her own safety jeopardized. She realized she had walked the only path possible, a tightrope of firm, professional defiance that protected her patient without escalating the violence. Her greatest weapon that day wasn't her medical knowledge, but her unshakable composure. It was that composure that shone through on the videos, creating a moral clarity that no one could deny. The ultimate lesson from that sun-drenched street in Orlando is one of authority versus duty. Authority demands obedience for its own sake. Duty demands action for the sake of others. The uniform and the badge grant authority, but the oath and the training impose a duty. When the two come into conflict, true character is revealed. Maya Jordan understood that her duty to preserve life was a higher calling than an officer's demand for procedural convenience. She chose the harder path, the path of righteous defiance. And in doing so, she not only saved a life, but also reaffirmed a fundamental truth. The purpose of all first responders, police and paramedics alike, is not to be in charge, but to be of service. What does true courage look like in your profession or your daily life? Have you ever been in a situation where doing the right thing meant challenging authority? Share your thoughts below.